the heart was almost quivering, and it was something that they'd never seen before, and basically said it was incompatible with life.
Aydin, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
How old are you?
38 as of 2 days ago.
Oh, no way. Happy birthday, man. Well, happy belated birthday. Did you celebrate? Did you have a...
We had some Persians. We're in Thunder Bay, and that's the specialty donut.
Yeah? Did you know about Persians before you came to Thunder Bay?
No, I knew nothing about Persians.
Do they live up to the hype?
Yeah, we have been enjoying the Persians that we've been trying.
Okay, good. Where are you from? Where did you grow up?
Born and raised in Vancouver, Greater Vancouver, BC, in a town called Richmond, just south of Vancouver. Spent pretty much all of my childhood there. Went to UBC, and then did some traveling after I finished my undergrad. Went to Southeast Asia and taught some English in China, and then also spent a number of months in Costa Rica doing some development work. But apart from that, I've spent most of my life in Vancouver.
Great. Where did you meet your wife, and kind of how old were you guys when you met? And what were your aspirations when you met as far as parenting went?
Good question. So we met many moons ago, almost half my life ago. I was 20 and Abby, my wife, was 19. I was doing a cycling trip through Europe from Spain to Italy along the Mediterranean, and we were setting out in Barcelona, spending a few nights there before we set off, and Abby was there from some of her friends from university. We happened to sit next to each other at a table at the hostel bar, started chatting. One thing that led to another, we stayed in touch, and all these years later, we're together. What's the word that people use? Fate?
Yeah. So you guys met, you hit it off, you started dating, and did you guys eventually get married?
Yeah, we got married, I think in 2019. And so it was about 13 years after we had met. Marriage was never super important to me, in the sense that in my view, someone makes a commitment to be with someone every single day. It's not something that you do once and then you're bound to that just because it's what you're supposed to be bound to. For Abby, it was more important, and that's why we eventually got married. As far as your question around outlook on having a family, I always had a sense that I would have a family. I grew up in a tight-knit family with very supportive parents, very lucky in that regard, and it just kind of was my default internal belief that I would have a family of my own one day.
You got married, and then I guess, did you wait to have children after you got married, or did you start trying right away to... We
had talked about having children, and for Abby, it was important to be married prior to having children. And so when we started talking about having children is when we also decided to get married.
And then you got married, and did you start trying for children right away?
We did, yeah.
Okay. And at this point, so you said 2019. So how old were you and how old is Abby?
I would have been about 34 and Abby's 33 at that time.
Okay. Walk me through how things were or weren't going as you were expecting.
Yeah, so everything was smooth. Abby got pregnant in spring 2019. Everything was smooth for the first half. She basically got pregnant right after we started trying. Everything was smooth until approximately the week 20, what they call the anatomy scan, where they check to make sure that everything is growing as it should. All the organs are in place, the right size, and so on. So this is August 2019. Biking over to the hospital to have the anatomy scan. So it would be Abby receiving the scan, but I wanted to be there to support her. And then I was going to a board meeting right after that for an organization that I volunteered with, and then onwards to a friend's he was having a big Sikh wedding with events all week. This was a Wednesday, and I was to go onwards to one of the celebrations for the wedding. Got to the hospital, very relaxed. Everything seemed as it should. I was very excited to be having our first kid. And then the person who is doing the scan, the sonographer, I believe, disappeared after a little while. We didn't think anything of it, but then the doctor came in and started doing more measurements and more scans, and was taking quite a while. And so we were getting a little bit concerned, but my default is just everything is right until I know otherwise.
Right.
I just assume everything is going to go well. Long story short, she tells us that the heart is basically not a normal heart. It was not growing as it should be. The proportions were not one of a healthy heart, and that we would need to return to the hospital for further measurements, echo, about a week later. And so I remember immediately consoling Abby and saying, maybe measurements that they're taking today aren't accurate because they're just kind of a primary equipment, and the measurements that we get next week and the further information, it may turn out to be all right. And I recall very vividly the doctor saying, just to kind of set our expectations, this is not a normal heart. Mm-hmm. So we waited for about 10 days or so, and we had basically a full day at the hospital where in the morning they did a bunch of testing on the heart of our newborn, who was still in the womb at that point. And then in the afternoon, basically they gathered us around with a geneticist and a few doctors to break the news that our little one had what's called tetralogy of Fallot, absent valve syndrome, which basically means in tetralogy there's 4 different issues wrong with the heart. It's a fairly well-known issue. The prognoses vary. It's uncertain how extensive the issue may be, but along with that, they had seen that the heart was not beating in a way a normal heart, if you think about it, should go do-doom, do-doom. That the heart was almost quivering, and it was something that they'd never seen before, and basically said it was incompatible with life. The doctor panel said that it was up to us to decide how we wanted to go forward.
That is so hard. That is so hard to experience that. I'm sure it was hard for you, but I'm sure it was extra hard for Abby in particular. And I think given it was your first child, I'm sure there was an extra weight on top of that. And I really feel for you in that moment, because, this is something that you've looked forward to. This is something that you and Abby looked forward to. So yeah, I can imagine how tough that was. So now you're left with this like almost impossible decision to make. I could guess what the options were that you were given, but I'm going to let you continue and tell me kind of what your options were at that point.
Yeah, so basically the option is to just go forward with the pregnancy with the knowledge that the baby is likely going to die as soon as they come out because of basically a non-functioning heart, or to terminate the pregnancy, and then under the umbrella of terminating the pregnancy, which option we wanted to go forward with. And so for us, I mean, it wasn't an easy decision, but it was less complicated because it was pretty clear that there was no possibility of a viable life. It's one thing that I definitely give gratitude for, is that with that quivering heart, we knew that no matter what, there was no life that we were going to be trying to save by moving forward. And so we decided to terminate the pregnancy. We did decide to have a stillbirth where there's an actual pregnancy, and then we were able to spend some time with our child after she had. So basically, they stop the heart right before they induce the pregnancy. And so we were able to spend some time with our deceased newborn, about 20 hours or so.
Wow.
Before having to say goodbye.
Why was that valuable for you to do that? Or why did you choose to spend time with the baby that had passed?
I think that the practitioners around us had said that people who went that route felt the most calm or sense of peace as much as possible in that situation. Getting to know the baby and spending a little bit of time with them. I don't know if that was the right choice. I don't know if there is a right choice, so to speak.
Do you totally regret doing that? Or do you feel like there was some value that you got from spending that time?
I mean, I don't regret it. I do wonder if I feel more pain having spent time with the little girl and getting to know her and naming her and going through the birth, which was a difficult birth. But it's not something that I would for a moment think about changing. It's just part of the path.
For sure. And I think it's such a good way to view it that way. It's just the path that you were on, and it's just a part of the journey. How was Abby during that experience?
During that very trying day, we were very on the same page. There's just a complete devastation on all parts, and not just for myself, for Abby and for my family and her family and the people around us. And that's really difficult because not only am I dealing with my own loss and devastation, I'm seeing the people around me that I care most about also going through the same thing. And that, in addition to my own grief, really ripped me apart having to see that and go with that. And I would say in terms of how was Abby, it's not a linear path of grief and recovery. It rears its head sometimes when you don't expect it. For Abby and myself, we grieved very differently. For Abby, the milestones were very important. So we ended up naming our little baby girl Cosmo, and the day that Cosmo was supposed to have her due date was very emotional for Abby. Other days that Cosmo should have hit certain milestones were very emotional for Abby. And for myself, the milestones just weren't that important in the sense that it added to the sense of loss. I was more sporadic in that certain days I may just feel really emotional and upset and that sense of loss more than other days without any underlying rhyme or reason.
For sure. I'm guessing even though you spent as little time as you did, 20 hours, in that time it seems like that child left an impression on you. And I think in a way you can kind of, as hard as it might have been, you can kind of appreciate the beauty of that moment though, because she was significant, right? And I think it's great that you mourn her. Personally, this is my opinion. I think it's great that a piece of her still lives with you and still grieves for her a little bit, because in my mind and how I like to view things is that she was worth it, right? So yeah, but no doubt that is just unbelievably difficult. Did this experience strain your relationship with Abby at all?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a strain, not understanding where the other one was coming from, having to deal with that pain and that loss and that lack of joy, and that not just a loss at the time, but that loss of hope for certain things and a future that would be a certain way. Absolutely. And actually we went to counseling, and that was very helpful for us to be able to sound out how we were feeling and how we were approaching things in a neutral setting, and for us to understand that, for me, for example, to understand that for Abby, it's okay that these milestones are really important, and understanding where she's coming from, and for Abby to understand why the milestones aren't as important, but how I grieve in my own way, in my own time when those feelings arise.
Yeah. Totally. One thing I've learned about relationships is that often when we get upset at the other person is because we're thinking that they view the world and react to the world the way that we do. So I'm gonna just project into your situation for a bit. Like let's say I was in that situation with my wife. Because she wasn't grieving the way that I thought, it probably looked like she didn't care, or that she cared too much by grieving a certain way. I was like, why are you focusing on this where this doesn't matter? But, just understanding that that was how she grieved, I think that's an important thing to realize. And like, thank God for counseling, because, as intelligent as many of us are, it's not always intuitive, just kind of interpreting how another person is reacting to a circumstance or something like that, right? So yeah, like I could totally see how something like this could strain one's relationship. You look at kind of how life progresses, right? Never do you anticipate that the anomaly is going to happen to you, right? So when it does, it just like totally shatters you. And I could see how that can happen, man. And like, yeah, that must have been so, so hard. So here you guys are now. You've grieved the loss of your little baby. You experienced some hardship through your relationship as a result of the experience. You went to counseling. It seems you took some very valuable things away from counseling. And now, what happens next in the story?
Yeah, I wish I could say that the lemonade was ready at that point.
Would have been nice, eh?
But the journey was longer. And so that was August 2019. Fall 2019, we tried again, and Abby had a miscarriage, an unexplained miscarriage.
How far into the pregnancy was she?
Not far, maybe about a month or so. So pretty early on, and not nearly the depth that the first one had gone to, but it compounded with that first one.
Absolutely.
At that point, I said that I wanted to take a step back from trying and just take some time. I had a bad concussion a little bit prior to that. I was struggling with my health related to that. And so it was a lot to deal with. We were starting counseling around that point, and counseling was also a process. And so we were not at a point where, at least for myself, I felt like I could be in 100% in supporting Abby and moving forward with trying again. And so we took a break for about 6 months when we were still working things out as a couple. I remember I booked a trip to Japan that was about 4 months in the future, as kind of something for us to look forward to and get outside of our own bubble of rain that seemed to be always hovering over us. And so fast forward to Japan, March 2020, the pandemic hits right as we're there. So that was an interesting trip. It actually worked out great time-wise.
Nice. Was it pretty empty? Like there was not a lot of tourists there, eh?
There were no tour groups. There were just a few tourists. It was early March, so we actually moved our return flight up a few days to try and get home, just recognizing that things were about to go crazy. But just a bit of a piece of fortune there. So it was a nice trip for us to both go on and connect together and inhabit a place that was not entirely focused on our loss from the last year.
Once you got back from that trip, did you feel then you guys were in a place to try again at that point?
Yeah, so we were in a better place. I was in a better place in terms of my own health. So we tried again, and Abby got pregnant. She got to about 12 weeks pregnant. Our next door neighbor, who they were similar age as us, were also pregnant a few weeks earlier. I remember having dinner on their patio one evening and all the four of us talking about how excited we were. And then a few days after that, we go in for a scan and there is no heartbeat. And that was probably more devastating than the first one, in the sense that the cruelty of it all. I've always been a very optimistic person and feel like things are on my side, and at that moment I just couldn't understand this additional loss, and having the next door neighbors, having to be next door to them while they got further along in the pregnancy and birth, it felt like
Feels
it
unfair.
was difficult
Feels
pill
unfair.
to swallow. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like what's going on here? And I mean, the answer to that is hardly ever straightforward. I mean, pregnancies on its own is quite a miracle of a thing in and of itself. It's quite a complex. I mean, it's simple when you think about it, egg sperm, but the whole process is quite complicated. And then, was there a particular reason why you were having such bad luck with this?
A few weeks later on that loss, testing came back that the child had Down syndrome. And so, I mean, it's not that well known, but there's actually a considerable amount of loss in utero that occurs with fetuses that have Down syndrome and don't actually make it to a viable stage. It's just the children with Down syndrome that is the least severe that make it to a place that they're able to come into the world. And so for that baby who we named Buddy, signs pointed to the Down syndrome as being the cause of not moving forward.
Now, I don't know how much you know about Down syndrome, but it was always something I thought happened to like much older women, like women in their 40s that were trying to have children. That's when I thought Down syndrome was more prevalent. But at this point, Abby's 34, 35. Is that common amongst women that age, that Down syndrome is a thing?
It happens. I mean, the older you get, statistics show the greater likelihood there is of having a child with Down syndrome. That's not to say that a 19-year-old or 22-year-old can't have a kid with Down syndrome. It's just probabilities.
Mm-hmm. Man, that is tough. There's no words to explain that kind of a loss, right? Because to some people, a child is only real once they've been born, right? But to others, and I'm getting the sense, especially for you guys, that you've established a connection, especially by naming the child. You've established a connection while they're in utero. What that comes with is that when it doesn't work out, you feel it more because you have a stronger connection with that child. What was it about that third one that made it so tough?
You were talking about how no one expects something negative like our first loss to happen, but for whatever reason, throughout my life, I always had a sense that I may have one day a child with a disability. I just felt like I had been granted the patience to be able to support someone with a need for extra supports. And when Cosmo had her heart issue, I was like, maybe that's the feeling that I always had, and that had to happen. And okay, we've worked through it. She's always going to be in our lives and a part of us, but we have the ability and the emotional wherewithal to move on and try again. And so for that that loss to happen another time at a point 12 weeks where you're starting to get positive again, and in an environment where the next door neighbors were having a very similarly aged kid, knowing that we would have to be living next door to them, it just hit me harder than the first time.
For sure. So at this point, are you feeling a sense of despair, like maybe this isn't something that's going to happen in our future type thing? Is that part of the grieving, or is it mostly because you felt like things just weren't happening the way you thought it was supposed to play out, and maybe that the first two was kind of a fluke kind of thing, and maybe the third one was like, this is a pattern actually?
Yeah, there's definitely some of that. There's a cumulative despair, and it gives me empathy for people that have had difficult lives, and understanding that after that loss, a little bit of doubt creeping in terms of, is this the way my life is supposed to go? And recognizing that for people that have not had a supportive childhood and teenage years and early adulthood, and have had barriers where they haven't had much luck overcoming. As they get older, that is very difficult to keep out of your mind in terms of things not going your way. And I remember coming out of the clinic after they had failed to find the heartbeat and just being in a complete fog and wanting to walk into traffic because I just felt such a sense of despair. And luckily, with the support of the people closest to me, I was able to get through that. Abby was able to get through that. We were able to try. Again, we had a fourth and fifth miscarriage, unfortunately, which were difficult to deal with, but at least for us, an early miscarriage just didn't carry the same emotional weight, emotional sense of loss as the first and the third losses.
Yeah, that's understandable. So at this point, you're probably thinking like, maybe this is not how this is going to happen. The fire for parenthood, though, was it still there? Or was there a point where you were like, maybe parenting is just not for me?
I think those thoughts start to creep in. Like, what would my life look like if I wasn't a parent? All of a sudden, there's a different path that I'm taking, that Abby's taking, and starting to wonder about that.
So at this point, what's the next move for you guys?
So around that time, my brother, who lives in London in the UK, had a cardiac arrest, where his heart completely stopped for 3 minutes. Luckily, he had someone, a colleague who knew CPR, and he was right in a busy district of London where the ambulance was able to arrive within 3 minutes and use an AED and bring it back. And he's no health issues now, no issues with loss of oxygen to the brain. It's like it never happened.
Do you know what happened?
It's interesting. He just had a follow-up with his doctor team in London this week, and the results show nothing conclusive in terms of the cardiac MRI as to what might have caused that. And so we still don't know, but we started to say maybe there's more to the story here that we need to be looking at. There had been some genetic testing sent off from Cosmo just to see if there are any genetic components that could be identified. And I had come back, the test had come back showing that I had a mutation in the MYH7 gene, which can lead to, well, it's a genotype that can have a higher chance of mutations in the heart. And so my dad has a heart condition. My brother had this cardiac arrest. My grandpa had some heart issues. And so at that point, I had been tested and also showed up positive for this MYH7 gene that Cosmo had. We started to look at it and say, you know what, maybe this is the cause for these losses, and we should look at alternative routes that are available to lessen the chance of loss going forward.
Right. Well, what does this mean for you and your health now and in the future?
So I'm being monitored. I have a mild case of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which in simple terms is a thickening of the heart muscle. But there's nothing that shows up in everyday life. I wouldn't know that I had it if not for cardiac MRI and echo and ECG and Holter testing.
Yeah. With this knowledge of this genetic influence on your ability to have a child, what kind of discussions are you having at this point?
Yeah, good question. So we're looking at what our options are. We know that IVF has some advantages over natural methods of becoming pregnant in that implantation could be more closely monitored. The embryos can get to a point where they're tested and shown as viable before implantation. And really at this point, we wanted to minimize our chances for loss. We both felt completely battered by the whole process. And we decided to move forward with IVF. I mean, the significant disadvantage is the cost.
How much?
It's about $30,000 Canadian.
Wow.
And so, I mean, one thing I say is that the cost of raising a child until adulthood is maybe 3, 4, 500,000, and so that's a small percentage of that. But I do recognize that is a very privileged thing to be able to say, because if you don't have the $30,000, then you're not able to do IVF.
Right.
And so, coming from a place where we did fortunately have the money and were able to move forward, I could justify it in terms of looking at the bigger picture cost of raising a child. And it's something that we really prioritize in our lives.
Right. Is it the type of thing that you can shop around for and get like a better price somewhere, or is it pretty standard?
The pricing is pretty standardized. You could shop around to some extent for the care. Really luckily for us, living in Vancouver, where there's some really cutting edge companies that have been leaders in the IVF field that we were able to speak with, and that they lived 10, 15 minutes down the road.
Right. Did you know anyone that took this route that prompted you to consider this route, or was it more research, or was it more that you just always kind of knew that this was an option? Like, how did you arrive to consider this as a real option?
I'd known of people. I'd never, I didn't have any close family or friends that I'd really gone through the process with. I think Abby was more tuned in to people who had been through the process and understanding what it entailed. And she was definitely in favor of it and felt like the positives outweighed the negatives.
Okay. Right. Were you skeptical at all, or was it just like, yeah, we want kids, let's do this?
No, I don't think there was skepticism. I think that physically it's a lot more intense for the woman who goes through the egg development and retrieval. And so for myself, just wanting to be supportive and have the best chance possible of success.
Mm-hmm. Were you both on board with this, or did someone need a little more convincing?
I think we were both on board.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Walk me through your first interaction with someone on that side, like of an IVF representative.
So what jumps out to me is the legal implications. There's a whole bunch of legal implications related to going through IVF and being presented with a package of documents that I needed to go through and sign on many different scenarios and confidentiality considerations.
So before we go through your experience of this process, walk me through, like, explain to me, like you were explaining to a labradoodle, what IVF is, how it works, and
Sure. So basically, with IVF, the idea is that the eggs are harvested, and then there's an option to basically inject sperm into the eggs, grow the embryo to 5 days, send it off for genetic testing, basically biopsy the embryo, send it off for genetic testing. And from that, we were able to see which embryos had the MYH7 gene mutation and which didn't, and choose to implant the ones that didn't have the MYH7 gene mutation. And interestingly, so we got to that point where Abby's eggs were harvested. I think we had a really good result from that. We had about 18 eggs. The sperm was injected into the eggs. We got to, I think, 11 successful embryos. And from there, we had 9 embryos that made it to day 5. Which is kind of the minimum age where you can freeze the embryo and later thaw it out to implant it. And that's, I mean, there's people that go through IVF and have 0 results and end up doing 2 or 3 or 4 or more attempts at IVF. And so the cost and the mental and physical difficulty adds up. And so in that sense, we were very lucky. So we got to a point where we had 9 embryos that were frozen after day 5, sent them off for biopsy. It came back that I believe 5 had the MYH7 gene mutation and 4 didn't. And that led to an interesting discussion between Abby and myself about, okay, do we implant the ones that don't have the gene mutation? And Abby's take was, well, that would basically be screening out you as in myself, because I have the MYH7 gene mutation. And that's kind of a weird thing to wrap one's head around, is that as far as we know, I mean, I'm 38 now. I have no health issues that have impacted me related to my heart, even though there is a condition that is mild and being monitored right now.
Now, walk me through that again. So you're saying she wanted to consider using one of the MY87 embryos, at least leave it as an option, because if she didn't, it would be like metaphorically like not having you there.
Yeah, it was a conversation in that if for example my parents had similar issues and genetically tested, recognizing hypothetically, because the science is quite recent, wouldn't have been around in the time of my parents having kids, and decided to screen out any embryos with the MYH7 gene mutation, they would have screened me out and I would have never come into existence.
Right. Okay.
So it was a conversation, ultimately recognizing the loss, the cumulative loss that we had been through, and wanting to minimize the chance of loss moving forward. We decided to implant one embryo that did not have the gene mutation. So we still have 8 in the freezer. Not to jump ahead, but there may be a time if we decide to have more than 4 more kids, which is unlikely, but embryo transfers can often be unsuccessful. Or if it gets to that point, we do have those frozen embryos with the gene mutation to consider implanting.
Right. Wild. This is like the pinnacle of combining nature and technology in a way. Eh? It's quite amazing how far technology has come and what it's able to do. And I mean, I can imagine the experience of it, but man, it's just like, it's mind blowing now what's possible, and the options that it gives people, right? Yeah. So they implanted an embryo.
Yeah. So they implant an embryo in Abby. It's just like at that point, actually, I'll back up a few weeks. To implant an embryo, the uterine lining needs to get to a certain thickness, and so Abby would take drugs that would thicken the lining and mimic the early stages of pregnancy, so that her uterus would be able to hold the embryo upon implantation. And there were some issues around getting that uterine lining thick enough, and the doctors at the IVF clinic would not implant unless it reaches that minimum threshold. And so I remember for a few week period there was kind of an oh no, like if we can't implant to Abby, then what, we have these quote unquote viable embryos. Do we start to look for a surrogate? In Canada, you can't pay for a surrogate. It has to be a volunteer. In the US, you can actually pay for a surrogate. There's thriving surrogate economies in many places in Eastern Europe. And so starting to have those questions. Thankfully, Abby reached the very minimum threshold in her lining, and they were able to go ahead and implant. And so the first couple weeks leading into a couple months were pretty fraught. At one point, Abby had spotting, and we were both kind of like, oh no, is this
Not again?
Not exactly, not again. I mean, at this point, I'm just excited to get to the success and talk about our little guy, Gabriel, who came into the world 8 or so months after that implantation.
So the first implantation went through.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Now we're at the lemonade.
Yeah, pretty
Awesome.
Pretty amazing.
Okay,
and
so
he's just a joy.
So let's fast forward a bit to like you're at, Abby's at like 8 months pregnant. Like, what are your feelings around at that time? Is it like this one might go. Cause I bet at still, you've probably been still so bruised from your previous experiences that in your mind there's still that doubt, that thing scratching at your hope that maybe something's gonna go wrong.
Yeah, there's almost a sense of disbelief. Like, it's surreal. I mean, Abby did have a difficult late stage pregnancy in that she had preeclampsia, and so Gabriel was actually induced 3 weeks early, and so it all came a little bit more quickly than maybe it otherwise would have, and that the feeling that stands out from that period is disbelief in that it didn't seem like it was real, and I didn't know how to approach it because of that sense of loss accumulating from previous years, and also recognizing that we were really close to having this thing that we had worked so hard for and gone through so much anguish for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Even under the best of circumstances, I think labor and delivery is a terrifying, is terrifying the right word, is a anxious, there's some anxiety that comes with the whole labor and delivery part, even in the best of circumstances. So I am, 3 weeks early, given the history that came with Gabriel, I'm sure you guys were a bit nervous going into that. But, fast forward through that, and now you've got how old's your guy?
He's just over 14 months.
Okay, and tell me about him a little bit. Tell me what he does, what you like, what's he doing at this stage?
Yeah, so I mean, the first 6, I'm on parental leave right now with Gabriel for 3 and a bit months, just to kind of set the scene. But the first 6 months or so after he was born, he was majorly colic, so just crying pretty much nonstop, and that was difficult. I think that there's both a sense that this is what we wanted, and what doesn't matter that he's crying all the time. This is just our absolute pure joy, combined with this is hard as F, and why are we going through this, and why does he keep crying, and especially Abby having to be with Gabriel all day while I was at work, the anxiety and difficulty that comes along with that, and the hormonal changes, it's a lot to kind of peel apart and figure out, and it's just kind of taking it one day at a time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's great. I've had the pleasure of meeting your little guy, and he's a beautiful, blonde-haired, brown-eyed, just loves to play, loves to smile.
Yeah, big smile. He grew out of that colic stage. He loves to laugh and joke. He's super energetic, super active, and every day I'm grateful for the time that I get to spend with him.
I did a quick research, like a quick Google search of like IVF. And it's just like all these ethical things came up. It seems like it's quite a charged topic in the realm of ethics. Why is it such a ethically charged topic, you think?
There's probably fear of the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can't speak extensively on that topic because it's not something that I dove into. Frankly, I don't really care what people that don't know our situation and have what's best for us in their mind when they speak. I don't really care what they think. So it's not something I wasted a lot of energy on trying to understand where the ethical hiccups were coming from.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And beyond this point, now that you've got, a beautiful little baby crawling around the place, do you guys think you'll try for another?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
definitely. I like that. Good. Do you know how many kids you want?
We'll take it one by one.
You know what, man? That is the right way to do it. And like what has parenthood done for you and your relationship with Abby?
Yeah, you go from 2 to 3, and then all of a sudden there's not one dynamic between myself and Abby, but there's three. There's myself and Abby, there's myself and Gabriel, and there's Abby and Gabriel. And so in everything we do, we need to consider how it impacts Gabriel, and it's putting someone outside of our relationship between the two of us first, which is a beautiful thing, but it also necessitates finding time to water that dynamic between just myself and just Abby, so that it doesn't get washed away by what Gabriel, basically how Gabriel impacts those interdynamics.
Yeah, I'm totally right there with you, man. I've got two kids under 3, and they just require so much energy and so much attention that in a way we've noticed we could go entire days together, but actually never speak to each other because we're giving so much attention to these kids, right? So it is so important to make sure you're giving time to your partner, because you and Abby are the cornerstone of the family, right? So if you knew someone was in a similar situation that you and Abby were in before IVF, would you recommend it? If you knew that the financial part wasn't an issue, and you saw this person struggling to have children, do you think it would be something you would say, hey man, you should probably consider this route because it's worked out for me type thing? Or would you be more hesitant to recommend it for someone else?
Yeah, it's hard for me to give a blanket recommendation. I think each situation is unique, and I would recommend that people be resourceful and inform themselves and be aware of their choices and their options, and make the best decision for themselves and really advocate for themselves, recognizing that the easiest information to get is not always the best and most useful information. For us, IVF has worked out great. I have nothing negative to say about it, and so I definitely wouldn't dissuade people from pursuing IVF if it made sense for them.
Right. Wish it were free. It'd be nice to get it free, eh?
Yeah, what's interesting is a few months after we went through IVF, Abby got a letter in the mail from her employer because she was on maternity leave at that time. So correspondence was taking place through the mail, and it was saying that as part of the benefits package, $15,000 towards IVF would be covered.
Unreal.
Going forward only. So I remember Abby being pretty upset that was not retroactive.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that her employer would number one spring that up on her as a surprise, like, hey, where were you when we were going through this, right? But yeah, that is interesting. I didn't think employers would support financially like an IVF thing.
Well, from the employer perspective, I mean, it's a hot labor market, and it's a way for the employer to differentiate themselves and appeal to potential employees. From the medical funding standpoint, I believe that the UK funds up to 3 cycles of IVF for all citizens, but Canada at this point doesn't fund any IVF.
Mm-hmm. Okay, last question here. And feel free to take some time to think about the answer. What would you say was the biggest takeaway from you from this lemon that life threw you?
Yeah, something that's become one of my mantras just to myself in terms of getting through difficult times is reminding myself of the impermanence of everything. So things might be really lousy today, doesn't mean they'll be lousy tomorrow or the next day. Things might be great today. Conversely, they might not be great tomorrow. And so just trying to remind myself of that and not getting too high or too low, appreciating good times when they happen, understanding that they're not going to last forever, and also when going through lousy times, understanding that having a lousy day doesn't guarantee a lousy day tomorrow.
Beautifully said. And on that note, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your story. You had me, I was at shaking at some points of your story because I was just like really putting myself in your shoes and feeling the pain that you must have felt. And I think, I think you have a beautiful family, and I think the life that you and Abby have created is absolutely wonderful. And I'm very happy that you have been able to participate in the journey of parenthood, because I think for those who want it, I think it has a lot to offer. So thanks again for sharing your story, and I wish you the best of luck in your future.
Appreciate that. Appreciate our friendship, and appreciate you having me on.
No problem.